The United States of America is a federal constitutional republic consisting of 50 states, multiple overseas possessions, and a federal district. This district, known as the District of Columbia, or DC for short, is unlike any other part of the United States. But what distinguishes DC from the other 50 states? Today's video will attempt to answer that question. Before we proceed, however, I would like to mention that the idea for this video came from a piece of legislation known as the Washington, D.C. Admission Act. Back on June 26, 2020, the House of Representatives passed this legislation. If both the Senate and the President give their assent, then D.C. would become the 51st state in the Union. But wait a moment, why is a federal district being considered for statehood? Theoretically, admitting D.C. as a state would, among other things, grant the citizens of the district something that they have been denied for more than 2 centuries: political equality with the rest of the country. And the issue of inequality among citizens and subdivisions is what characterizes the political relationship between D.C. and the 50 states. Before going into the issue of D.C. statehood any further, let's talk about what we originally came here to do. Discuss the differences between a state and a federal district, and talk about how the history of admitting states gave us our present situation. Part 1. A state versus the district. A U.S. state is basically a self-governing political unit within a larger independent or national federation. As we all know, there are 50 of these states. 48 of them are contiguous, while the other 2, Alaska and Hawaii, are separated from the main body of states by hundreds, if not thousands of miles. Distances between states notwithstanding, every state in the Union is entitled to representation in the federal government. First, Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution allows each state a presence in the House of Representatives according to its population. That means the more people in a state, the more representatives it sends to Congress. For example, California, the largest state by population, has 53 representatives in the House, while Wyoming, the least populous state, has 1 at-large representative. Next, Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution deals with the Senate, and unlike the House, every state, no matter its population, gets 2 senators. And besides representation in Congress, a state has the right to maintain its territorial integrity. This means that while Congress can admit new states, the federal government cannot create one within the borders of an existing state without its consent. And this has happened at least once. For instance, in 1792, Congress admitted Kentucky, which was then a part of Virginia, as a state. For more information about Kentucky's peaceful secession from Virginia and how West Virginia became a state, please find a link to a video from the channel Brain for Breakfast in the description. But wait, there's more! Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution also says that each state is guaranteed a Republican form of government. Now, this clause has nothing to do with political parties. Put it simply, Republican in the American system means a government containing 3 co-equal branches. These branches are legislative, executive, and judicial. This may sound familiar because the federal government has the same structure, with Congress being the legislature, the president the executive, and the Supreme Court is the judiciary. Now, the federal government is the supreme law of the land, and in exchange for this recognition, states reserve the power to, among other things, tax, regulate internal commerce, create local governments, oversee elections, ratify constitutional amendments, and select presidential electors for the Electoral College. Boy, that was a lot to unpack. But how does D.C. compare to a state? To begin with, Congress created the District of Columbia as the permanent seat of the United States government. The Residence Act of 1790 established D.C. on an 100-square-mile piece of land along the lower Potomac River. Both Maryland and Virginia originally donated the land in question, but Congress returned Virginia's portion in 1847. What distinguishes D.C. from an individual state is Clause 17 in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Basically, Congress has the authority to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such a district, which means Congress even to this day maintains direct authority over the affairs of D.C. and its residents. More on this later. And no such clause governs Congress's relationship with each of the 50 states. Thus, D.C. citizens have no effective representation in Congress. But what if D.C. were to become a state? Let's take a moment to discuss how it would measure up to the other 50 states in terms of land, population, and wealth. Okay, here we go. In land area, Alaska is the largest state, measuring 570,640 square miles or 1.4 million square kilometers. It's twice the size of the Lone Star State of Texas, the largest of the contiguous lower 48. By contrast, Rhode Island is the smallest state with a land area of 1,043 square miles or 2,678 square kilometers. A DC state would be a lot smaller than Rhode Island. The proposed 51st state would only measure 61 square miles or 158 square kilometers. Population, however, tells a different story. According to the 2019 estimated census, California is the largest state with roughly 37,253,956 residents, while Wyoming is the smallest with an estimated population of 578,759 residents. But DC's population, which is 705,749 persons, would rank the proposed 51st state at number 49, 2 places higher than both the states of Wyoming and Vermont. Now, how about wealth? Well, one way to measure that statistic is through gross domestic product, or GDP. Out of the 50 states, California has the highest GDP, which is more than $3 trillion. Put this number in a global perspective, California's GDP would be comparable to that of India's, a country of more than 1 billion people. By contrast, Vermont has the smallest GDP, which is estimated at $35 billion. This number is similar to the GDP of the Eastern European nation of North Macedonia. DC, however, is a different story. It is home to the city of Washington, which anchors one of America's largest metropolitan areas. But metro areas like Washington, D.C. often cross state lines, and the total GDP of this metro area would include wealth from the states of Maryland and Virginia. The city of Washington itself, however, stops at the border of D.C., and that boundary provides us with a way to measure the wealth of our potential 51st state. With that in mind, DC's GDP is approximately $148 billion, which is slightly higher than the total GDP of Ukraine, a country located near Vladimir Putin's front yard. Okay, diplomatic jokes aside, if DC were the 51st state in the Union, it would rank 34th in GDP. Wow, that was a lot to go over. Now we can talk about how we got to the issue of DC statehood. Part 2. As America grows, so grows DC. Now, the story of DC is directly tied to the history of statehood itself. We begin in 1783, the year Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the new United States. Back then, the new country consisted of 13 Atlantic coastal states, a large tract of unorganized land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and it was all united under a weak central government called the Articles of Confederation. The Confederation is best remembered for its inability to build a united nation out of the original 13 states. While the Founding Fathers or Framers eventually replaced the Articles with the 1787 Constitution, the Confederation did establish the process in which unorganized territories become states. This was done primarily with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Initially, this legislation applied to an area known as the Northwest Territory, a domain largely consisting of the modern-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But after the 1787 Constitution went into effect, the ordinance was adopted for the admission of all future states, starting with Ohio in 1803. Now, how does the statehood process work? Basically, the Northwest Ordinance established a 3-step guide for statehood, starting with the territory. Once a territory was surveyed, Congress appointed a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges to oversee its development. When the territory's population reached 5,000 free citizens, they could elect the legislature to share power with the federally appointed officials. Finally, when the territory's population reached 60,000 free citizens, it could apply for statehood. The ordinance also mandated that every new state would be politically equal to the original 13. Now, what does all this have to do with DC? Well, we're getting to that. You see, the Northwest Ordinance also had within it a clause that banned the expansion of slavery into the Great Lakes region. This rule, however, did not apply to the rest of the United States. And as America expanded into a transcontinental nation, its inability to stop the spread of slavery led to the Civil War in 1861. But as the country tore itself apart, the war enabled DC's transition from a small seat of government into a thriving city. Before we explain how that growth occurred, we need to go back to 1790. That was the year the federal government established the District of Columbia via the Residence Act. But why was such a district needed? Well, as James Madison in Federalist No. 43 noted, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It is a power exercised by every legislature of the Union, I might say the world, by virtue of its general supremacy. Without it, the public authority might be insulted and its proceedings interrupted with impunity. Such an event occurred in June 1783 when the Confederation Congress, then meeting in Philadelphia, had to leave the city to avoid an angry mob of Revolutionary War veterans. The Congress had discharged the soldiers without their long overdue pay, and the ex-servicemen responded by besieging the city. This uprising, along with other disruptions like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, motivated the framers to draft the 1787 Constitution and include within it a clause for a permanent seat of government. Once established in 1790, the city of Washington grew slowly. By 1860, it had a population of roughly 60,000. By contrast, New York City had grown from 49,400 in 1790 to 813,000 by 1860. New York grew quickly because of its geographic position as a transshipment point for immigrants and commerce going between Europe and the American interior west. In so doing, New York built the Erie Canal and invested in railroads which connected it to the upper Midwest. Now, Washington, D.C., while an Atlantic port, had little access to the Trans-Appalachian West by 1860. Thus, it grew slowly as America transitioned from a cluster of Atlantic settlements to a transcontinental nation. But as we all know, Americans paid an enormous price for the nation's westward expansion. As the country added more land and admitted new states, the expansion of slavery in the new territory led to the outbreak of the Civil War. But the great irony here is that the Union's violent breakup and difficult reconstruction had laid the foundation for Washington, D.C.'s future growth. The federal government expanded its power, influence, and bureaucracy during the Civil War. And this situation, along with the presence of a massive Union army encamped throughout the D.C. area, created more jobs and professional opportunities. By 1870, 5 years after the war had ended, the district's population had doubled to almost 120,000. But D.C. did not stop growing, not by a long shot. Over the next 80 years, Washington, D.C. became a major industrial center. Railroads and highways ultimately connected the city with the rest of the country. The federal workforce also expanded as America admitted new states, implemented the reforms of the Progressive Era and the New Deal, and fought 2 world wars. By 1950, as the United States had plunged headfirst into the frosty geopolitical waters of the Cold War, the District of Columbia's population had peaked to roughly 802,000. Unfortunately, the post-war effects of suburbanization, racial strife, and deindustrialization reduced DC's population to 572,000 by 1990. But over the last 30 years, Washington's population has rebounded to nearly 705,000. While the district's current population is roughly 100,000 off of its peak, DC still anchors a metro area of roughly 6 million people. Well, now we understand how the history of statehood is interconnected with the growth of Washington, D.C. Despite the district's population and wealth, its political relationship with the other 50 states is inherently unequal. So, how do we resolve this issue? Part 3. From incremental solutions to statehood? As we mentioned earlier, the Constitution grants Congress supreme authority over the District of Columbia and its residents. D.C. citizens, unlike citizens of a state, are in effect subject to direct congressional rule. And D.C.'s relationship with the rest of America is best represented on its license plates, which bear the phrase taxation without representation. But is Congress's rule over D.C. absolute? Well, the answer is a bit complicated. Since the end of the Civil War, Congress has, at times, granted some form of self-government to D.C. In the Organic Act of 1871, Congress consolidated the city governments of Washington and Georgetown into one district-wide municipality. The act also created a municipal government consisting of a 2-house legislature. One house was an 11-member congressionally appointed council, while the other was a 22-seat elected body called the House of Delegates. However, this system only lasted 3 years. Citing overspending and corruption, Congress replaced the legislature with a 3-member board of commissioners. This system remained in place until well after World War II, even as DC's political situation began to change. The success of the Civil Rights Movement encouraged DC residents to lobby Congress for greater electoral power. Congress and the states responded by ratifying the 23rd Amendment, which allocated 3 electoral votes for the District of Columbia. This amendment gave DC residents the power to vote for president, which they have done since 1964. In 1970, Congress granted DC citizens the right to elect a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives. But this individual has little power beyond serving on committees, drafting legislation, and addressing the House chamber. By far, the most progressive change which occurred for DC was the Home Rule Act of 1973. This legislation replaced the Board of Commissioners with an elected mayor and a city council. Yet for DC, home rule still had limits. In exchange for granting DC citizens an elected municipal government, Congress retained the right to control the district's budget, appoint its judges, and the right to veto any legislation passed by the City Council. This arrangement persists to this day, even as DC residents demanded more local control over elections. Congress's last response outside of statehood was a proposed constitutional amendment back in 1978. This amendment, known as the DC Voting Rights Amendment, would have given the district's citizens full representation in Congress. In so doing, DC citizens would have been granted 2 senators and 1 congressional representative. Congress passed the amendment, but the states failed to ratify it. Congress's long-term failure to resolve DC's unequal relationship with the other 50 states has enabled the establishment of groups such as DC Vote to lobby for statehood. For more information, a link to this organization's webpage can be found in the description below. Now, DC statehood would theoretically resolve 2 political issues. One is equality among states and citizens in the domains of congressional representation and taxation, and the second is local control of politics. DC, like many major U.S. cities, trends more toward the liberal-progressive end of the political spectrum. In fact, DC residents have consistently voted for Democratic presidential candidates since the 1964 election. Groups like DC Vote have recently succeeded in getting Congress's attention. While the House of Representatives recently approved the DC statehood measure, it was largely along party lines. And since Democrats control the House and the Republicans have the Senate, a Republican Senate is unlikely to pass a DC statehood proposal. But for now, though, we can speculate on what a DC state would look like. First, the current legislation would establish the official name of the 51st state as Washington Douglas Commonwealth. The new state name would keep the DC initials, but it would honor Frederick Douglass, the 19th century writer, orator, and abolitionist. The proposed state would also have 2 senators and 1 at-large representative. As for the layout of the state itself, Douglas Commonwealth would encompass the entire present-day District of Columbia except for the following areas: the White House, Capitol Hill, and the National Mall. These places would remain under congressional jurisdiction. So that is basically the entire story, or at least as much as we can fit into a fairly short video. We would like to take this opportunity to thank you for visiting our channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell button. Thank you again, and stay positive.